On my birthday, my son pushed me out of the company I built. The wife's envelope changed everything. It was my 58th birthday, but the celebration didn't feel like mine. The restaurant had been chosen by my father-in-law, Charles Beaumont, a man who could order half of Wall Street to change its lunch reservations with a single call. He had flown in from New York the night before and made sure the reservation was under his name, not mine. That was his style, always the host, even when he wasn't paying. My son, Ethan, 33, sat at his side. Ethan is the current CEO of Orion Dynamics, the company I founded in San Jose 25 years ago. Back then, Orion was nothing more than a rented office above a garage, and a handful of engineers writing middleware nobody thought was worth much. Today, it is a Delaware-incorporated public company with offices in 3 countries and contracts with 2/3 of the Fortune 500. When the waiter poured the wine, Ethan stood and raised his glass. "To my father," he said, voice steady, trained by too many investor calls. "The man who built Orion. The man who showed me how to lead." I smiled, but the words landed differently than they once did. I had learned to listen not only to what my son said, but also to what he avoided saying. He never mentioned partnership, never said "with him," only "before me" or "who showed me." Charles leaned back in his chair, silent but approving, the way bankers do when the terms are going exactly as they arranged. Dinner moved along politely. The first course came and went. We discussed markets, interest rates, and the usual industry gossip. But as the plates were cleared, a courier entered the room and placed a black envelope in front of me. My name was written across the front in the block letters of Orion's corporate secretary. I opened it, expecting some ceremonial greeting. Instead, it was a notice. Special meeting of the board of directors. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Attached was a draft agenda. The first item, leadership transition. Vote to remove Michael Reed as executive chair. I looked up. Ethan kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his steak with precise movements. Charles raised his glass again, as if to toast the efficiency of the timing. "Just routine governance," Ethan said after a pause. "The company is evolving. We want to present a modern structure to investors. Clean lines, clear accountability." "By accountability," I said, "you mean removing the man who built the company from the boardroom?" Ethan met my eyes briefly. His look wasn't hostile. It was worse than that. It was confident, as if the decision had already been made. The votes counted. The press release drafted. Charles finally spoke. His voice was calm, practiced. "Michael, transitions are never easy, but investors prefer certainty. This is the right moment for a smooth change. You'll always be the founder. That will never change." I folded the agenda back into the envelope and set it aside. The candles on the cake were lit. The family sang the usual off-key chorus. I forced a smile. "Happy birthday," I told myself, as the room sang to a man they had already decided to push out of his own company. When the candles were out, I excused myself and went home. In my study, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a folder my late wife, Clara, had left me, labeled in her handwriting. Blue envelope. Only if they force you out. I hadn't touched it since the week before she died. She had asked me to keep it sealed until the day I truly needed it. Tonight, I realized, was that day. I turned on the lamp, sat at the desk, and opened the envelope. Inside were notarized documents, neatly arranged, and a letter in Clara's hand. At the top, in bold, were the words, Voting Trust Agreement, Transfer of Control, Orion Dynamics. Her note was short but clear. If they ever try to remove you for reasons other than performance, this document restores your control. Do not hesitate. Protect the company. Protect our son from himself. I leaned back in my chair, the paper trembling in my hand. Clara had anticipated this moment years before I had allowed myself to. She had known that Ethan's ambition, combined with Charles's influence, could turn against me. Tomorrow morning, they would walk into the boardroom believing they had the votes, the lawyers, and the market narrative. What they didn't know was that Clara had left me the one thing stronger than their strategy: legal control. I placed the document back into the folder, locked the drawer, and turned off the lamp. The house was silent. I was alone, but for the first time that evening, I didn't feel defeated. Tomorrow, I would walk into the boardroom not as the man they thought they could sideline, but as the founder with the final word. And that was how my birthday ended, with a song, a threat, and the beginning of a fight I hadn't planned on, but was ready to finish. The next morning, the boardroom was already full when I arrived. The long walnut table gleamed under recessed lighting. 12 leather chairs filled with faces I had once handpicked, engineers turned executives, a venture capitalist who had backed me in the garage years ago, and 3 independent directors added after the IPO. Now they were here not to celebrate, but to witness. Ethan sat at the head of the table, my usual seat. Charles was beside him, as if he owned the place, though his only stake in Orion was through influence. A stack of binders had been placed in front of each director, the top page stamped, Special Meeting Agenda, Leadership Transition. I took my seat 2 chairs down, deliberately not at the head. I wanted them to know I wasn't here to fight with gestures. I was here for the record. Ethan cleared his throat. Good morning. Thank you all for making the time. This session is about governance. Orion has entered a new phase, and investors expect clarity. As you know, Michael has served as executive chair since stepping down as CEO. Today, we propose moving forward with a refreshed structure. He spoke with rehearsed calm, like he was addressing analysts on an earnings call. Behind him, a screen lit up with slides: succession framework, investor confidence, streamlined oversight. Charles leaned forward, folding his hands. Continuity is critical. This is not about removing Michael's legacy. It's about building the next chapter. The street wants to see a decisive transition, not hesitation. You all understand how fragile multiples can be. The directors nodded, some with conviction, others with uncertainty. I saw the doubt in their eyes. They respected me, but they also feared being on the wrong side of a proxy battle. Liza, our general counsel, sat stiffly at the far end. Her laptop was open, a draft of an 8K filing glowing on the screen. The subject line read, Orion Dynamics announces leadership transition. Reed steps down as executive chair. It was ready to be sent to the SEC within minutes. Before we move to a vote, Ethan said, I'd like to share the succession memo prepared for our largest institutional holders. He tapped the screen. A confidential document appeared. Succession strategy, August. Bullet points outlined my planned departure, Ethan's ongoing role as CEO, and Charles's commitment to supporting shareholder alignment. I caught the small text at the bottom. Distributed to analysts, embargo lifted upon SEC filing. So it was already in the market's bloodstream. The banks were whispering. The analysts had drafts of their notes, and my exit was being treated as fact before it had even been voted on. Point of order, I said, keeping my voice steady. This board has not yet voted. Any distribution of this memo is premature and potentially misleading. A silence fell. Directors exchanged glances. Liza looked down, unwilling to meet my eyes. Dad, Ethan said, still using the word, though it felt like an act. We all know the vote will pass. The memo is simply preparing stakeholders for what comes next. What comes next, I said, is determined in this room, not in an email chain between bankers and analysts. I opened the leather folder Clara had left me. The voting trust agreement sat on top, the notarized pages crisp despite their age. Before any vote, the board needs to acknowledge this document. I slid copies across the table to each director. This is a trust executed by my late wife, Clara Reed. It stipulates that in the event of an attempt to remove me as executive chair for cause without cause, control of 60% of our Class B supervoting shares reverts to me. That condition is triggered today. Gasps broke the stillness. One director, David Cho, frowned as he read the signature page. This is notarized, dated 4 years ago, witnessed by Harrington. He was on this board at the time. Yes, I said, and still valid. Charles leaned forward, voice sharper now. This is a distraction. Even if the document is real, it is an abuse of intent. Clara never meant for you to weaponize her estate against her own son. I met his eyes. She meant exactly what she wrote. She knew governance matters most when loyalty blurs. Ethan shook his head. This changes nothing. Council will review it, but the fact remains. Orion can't move forward with 2 centers of gravity. Investors need me in charge. I turned to the directors. You're being asked to vote me out under the pretense of clarity. But what's really happening is a power play, engineered by Charles, backed by whispers on Wall Street, and packaged in a memo that was leaked before we even sat down. If this board allows that, it violates fiduciary duty. One of the independents, Karen Lopez, cleared her throat. Michael, if this trust holds, then technically you hold majority control. Is that your intent? To overrule us? No, I said firmly. My intent is to protect Orion from being stripped of independence by a private fund with its own agenda. My late wife gave me this authority for one reason: to keep this company aligned with its mission, not with Charles Beaumont's portfolio. The room shifted. Some directors leaned back, reconsidering. The momentum Ethan had carefully built began to falter. Charles tried again, his banker's tone carrying weight. Let's be realistic. The market won't wait for family disputes. The street already has this memo. If we backtrack now, we look weak. The stock will fall. Are you prepared to see billions in market cap erased just to prove a point? I looked around the table, at men and women who had built their reputations on numbers. I am prepared to tell the truth, even if the market punishes us for 1 quarter. Because 1 quarter of pain is better than a decade of manipulation. Ethan pushed his chair back. We can't operate like this. Dad, you're putting your pride above the company. No, Ethan, I said quietly. I'm putting the company above your pride. The room froze. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the HVAC. Finally, Karen spoke again. We should adjourn briefly and allow legal to review this trust. It would be irresponsible to proceed without clarity. Ethan's jaw tightened. Charles whispered something in his ear, too low for anyone else to hear. Ethan nodded reluctantly. We'll recess for 1 hour, he said. But make no mistake, this conversation isn't over. As the directors filed out, I stayed seated, my hand resting on Clara's document. The fight had only just begun. When the room was nearly empty, Liza lingered by the door. "Michael," she said softly, "there's something else you need to know. The SEC has asked questions about our Q2 revenue recognition. If they open a formal inquiry, this leadership fight won't just be about governance. It will be about survival." She left me alone with the papers. I looked down at Clara's signature, steady and certain. For the first time since dinner last night, I felt the ground shift back under my feet. But the next battle was already forming, not just against my son and Charles, but against regulators, analysts, and the very market that had once cheered me. By the time the board reconvened that afternoon, the news Fuanos had already leaked. Bloomberg posted a 2-paragraph piece. Sources suggest Orion Dynamics may be considering governance changes at the top. Founder Michael Reed could step back from his role as executive chair, with CEO Ethan Reed consolidating authority. The article was thin, but that was enough. Our stock dipped 3% by noon. The phones in investor relations wouldn't stop ringing. I spent most of the lunch break in my office, going through emails from the CFO, Baker. One in particular made my stomach knot. Credit facility covenant status. Breach risk if EBITDA margin falls below 16% in Q3. Current forecast, 15.8%. That wasn't a typo. It was a tripwire. Our $300 million revolving credit facility, arranged with Morgan Stanley 2 years ago, had half a dozen covenants. Most were routine. But the margin covenant was dangerous. If we tripped it, the banks could demand repayment or impose new terms. The irony was clear. Ethan's restructuring of legacy contracts to make revenue cloud-friendly had improved top-line growth, but shaved margins thin. I had warned him once in private not to overpromise the street. He'd told me I was still thinking like a founder, not like a growth CEO. Now we were staring at breach territory. At 1:30, I walked back into the boardroom. Ethan was standing at the head, Charles beside him, their laptops open to slides labeled Continuity Plan Draft. Before Ethan could begin, Baker entered, pale and sweating. He handed Ethan a note, then placed a second in front of me. I unfolded it. Rumor circulating, SEC reviewing Orion's Q2 recognition of deferred revenue. Formal inquiry possible. I looked up sharply. Where did this come from? Baker kept his eyes down. Whispers in New York. Analysts at JP Morgan mentioned it. One of our partners may have raised concerns. Which partner? Before he could answer, my phone buzzed. A message from Amara, our COO. Urgent escalation. Tesseract Cloud threatening to suspend integration unless billing dispute resolved. Client =Aerosys, our biggest. Come to lab. I stood abruptly. We have a partner escalation. Aerosys. If they pull, that's 12% of revenue. The directors shifted uneasily. Ethan raised his hand like a conductor. We're in the middle of a governance discussion. Ops can handle customer issues. I shook my head. Not this one. Aerosys is our largest customer. If they move to Tesseract directly, it won't just be lost revenue. It will validate every bear thesis on our business model. Charles leaned forward, voice calm but sharp. Michael, you're proving our point. You're distracted, emotional, jumping at operational fires. This is why we need consolidated leadership. The market wants a steady hand. Steady? I said. We're sitting on a margin covenant breach. an SEC rumor, and a partner dispute. That's not steady. That's crisis management. And you're pretending it's routine. Ethan exhaled slowly, as if humoring me. Dad, with respect, the company doesn't run on nostalgia. It runs on confidence. We'll issue guidance, we'll show the street a clear narrative, and the noise will fade. That's what leaders do. I saw heads nodding around the table, not in agreement with the facts, but in surrender to the perception. Directors don't like to be the last ones clapping. Karen Lopez, one of the independents, finally asked, Michael, are you suggesting we delay this governance transition until the covenant and SEC issues are resolved? I'm saying you don't replace a captain in the middle of a storm, I replied. Charles cut in. Unless the captain caused the storm. The words landed heavy. Several directors looked at me, waiting for my defense. For the first time in years, I felt my authority slipping. The trust document Clara had left me was real, but in the face of covenant breaches, SEC scrutiny, and partner disputes, it felt like paper against fire. At 3 o'clock, we broke again. I rushed to the lab where Amara was pacing, headset on. Screens showed dashboards full of red. She hung up and faced me. Tesseract is holding invoices. They say Ethan authorized discount structures off contract. If we don't pay penalties, they'll freeze the API. Did he sign side letters? Her silence was the answer. I rubbed my forehead. If Aerosys goes dark, the street will assume systemic risk. Combine that with the SEC rumor. Our stock won't drop 3%. It'll drop 30%. Amara lowered her voice. Michael, I need to know. Are you still in control? Because right now nobody knows who's running this company. I didn't answer. Because the truth was painful. I wasn't sure. By evening, the board had reconvened for a final session. Ethan presented a transition timeline that looked polished, inevitable. He spoke of market optics, fiduciary responsibility, clean execution. Words I had once used myself to reassure investors now turned against me. I tried to interject, but the director's attention had shifted. They were listening to Ethan, nodding at Charles. I felt like an old man at his own dinner table, watching his seat be taken by a guest who had already rewritten the menu. When the session adjourned, I was the last to leave. Liza stopped me at the door. Her voice was low, almost apologetic. Michael, the memo is out. Analysts are treating this as confirmed. By morning, it will be fact. I stepped into the empty corridor, the silence pressing in. For the first time since founding Orion, I felt irrelevant in my own company. The trust gave me legal power, but power on paper is fragile when the market, the banks, and your own board have already moved on. I walked back to my office and sat in the dark. Clara's letter was still in my drawer, her handwriting steady where mine was shaking. She had believed I could protect the company. Tonight, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. And somewhere across town, I knew Ethan and Charles were drafting tomorrow's press statement, one that would tell the world Orion had a new leader, whether I accepted it or not. I didn't sleep that night. The stock was down another 2% in after-hours trading. Messages from journalists stacked in my inbox. And on social media, speculation about my retirement spread as if it were already carved into stone. Ethan and Charles had achieved what they wanted. Momentum. But they didn't know what I had in my desk. At 2 a.m., I poured myself a coffee, sat in my study, and pulled out the blue envelope Clara had left me. My hands shook. not from the caffeine but from the weight of her foresight. I hadn't opened it fully yesterday, just enough to glimpse the trust agreement. Now I laid everything out on the desk. The document was meticulous. Clara had consulted William Harrington, our earliest independent director, before she passed. It was notarized, witnessed, and signed 6 days before her final surgery. It stipulated clearly, if Michael Reed is removed as executive chair for cause, without demonstrable cause, control of 60% of Orion Dynamics Class B supervoting shares shall revert to him in perpetuity. That clause was a knife disguised as paper. It meant any attempt to push me out under vague fiduciary language triggered the automatic transfer. Ethan and Charles thought they could dress up ambition as cause. Clara had already anticipated that play. Her handwritten note sat on top. Michael, you'll hesitate, because you always try to see the best in Ethan. But governance is not family therapy. If they push you, use this. Protect Orion. Protect him from himself. I read it 3 times, then leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Clara had understood the difference between love and trust. Love forgives. Trust requires rules. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I was done reacting. At 8:30 a.m., I walked into the office. My assistant looked startled. Word had spread I might not return. Mr. Reed, the press is asking if they can quote you on— Not yet, I said. Hold everything until after the board session. At 9 o'clock sharp, the directors assembled again. Ethan sat at the head, Charles at his side, looking confident. The 8K draft was still open on Liza's laptop, waiting to be sent. Before Ethan could begin, I set a leather binder on the table. Before we discuss leadership transition, the board needs to review this. I distributed copies of the trust. Silence fell as pages flipped. Karen Lopez adjusted her glasses. This is Clara's signature? Yes, I said. Witnessed by William Harrington, notarized, dated, valid under Delaware law. The trust stipulates that if I am removed for cause without clear demonstration of cause, control of 60% of Class B supervoting shares reverts to me. That condition has been triggered. Ethan leaned back, face tight. Dad, this is desperate. Even if it's real, you can't override the will of the board. That's not how governance works. It's exactly how governance works, I replied. You wanted to weaponize cause as a pretext. Clara wrote this to stop you. Charles spoke next, his tone sharp. Michael, even if this document holds, do you think the street will accept it? You'll look like an old man clinging to power with his wife's signature. Optics matter. Optics matter less than legality, I said. And this document is legally binding. I turned to Liza. Would you care to confirm? She swallowed hard. On its face, the trust is valid. We would need chancery review for enforcement. But yes, it carries weight. The directors murmured. The confidence on Ethan's face began to crack. This isn't about legacy, I continued. This is about protecting Orion from reckless decisions. We're one covenant away from default. The SEC is circling, and Tesseract is threatening to cut off our largest customer. And your solution, I looked directly at Ethan, is to consolidate power and issue a memo to the street? He slammed his hand on the table. Because we can't run a company with 2 voices, Dad. Investors need one leader. I kept my voice calm. Then let that leader be someone who doesn't need his grandfather's shadow to cast authority. Gasps echoed across the table. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Charles stepped in smoothly. We could challenge this trust in court. Drag it out for months. Do you want a public fight? The company would be paralyzed. Shareholders would suffer. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder. Already filed for an emergency hearing with Delaware Chancery this morning. Vice Chancellor has granted a temporary restraining order. No leadership changes until the trust is validated. That landed like a hammer. The directors stared at me, some surprised, some relieved. Karen spoke first. So the board is effectively frozen until the court rules? Yes, I said. And while we're frozen, we need to deal with reality. Covenants, SEC, and Aerosys. Those are existential. This power struggle is not. For the first time, the momentum shifted. Directors who had been leaning toward Ethan now sat straighter, reassessing. Charles's calm cracked just slightly as he adjusted his cufflinks too quickly. Ethan spoke again, voice lower. You're humiliating me. In front of the board. In front of everyone. I looked at him. Not as CEO, but as my son. No, Ethan. You're humiliating yourself. I'm giving you a chance to step back before this destroys you. He said nothing. His eyes darted to Charles, searching for backup. Charles stayed silent. I closed the binder, stood, and looked around the table. I will not be forced out with tricks. I will not let Orion become another Wall Street plaything. Clara trusted me with this authority. I intend to use it. The meeting ended without a vote. The directors filed out in tense silence. For once, Ethan had no memo to leak, no statement to spin. Back in my office, I opened Clara's note again. Her handwriting was steady, her words simple. Protect Orion. Protect him from himself. I realized then this wasn't just about me keeping control. It was about drawing a line Ethan could not cross without consequences. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. Because I knew the fight had shifted. I wasn't on defense anymore. I was in control. It didn't take long for Charles to strike back. By the end of the week, a glossy package landed on the desks of our top 50 institutional shareholders. On the cover, Orion, Restoring Ethical Governance. Inside were bullet points, pie charts, and selective quotes designed to make me look like a liability. The message was clear. Vote your proxies for Ethan's slate of directors and cut Michael Reed out once and for all. The blitz wasn't cheap. I knew Charles had paid for it himself through a Delaware-registered advocacy fund. He was too careful to tie it directly to his name, but everyone in the market knew where the money came from. Then came the leak. On Monday morning, Business Insider ran with the headline, Founder Reed questioned in expense review. Sources cite ethics concerns. The story claimed I had used corporate funds years ago to renovate a property in Tahoe. It wasn't true. Orion had reimbursed me for board retreats that auditors had cleared, but truth hardly mattered once the word ethics was in print. By noon, CNBC had picked it up. By market close, our stock had dropped another 6%. Inside the company, panic spread like fire. Employees whispered in the cafeteria. Slack threads filled with speculation. Some junior staff messaged me privately. Is it true? Should we be worried about our jobs? I walked the halls making eye contact, telling people to focus on customers, not rumors. But I could feel it. The shift. The energy that had once drawn people to Orion was fracturing under the weight of headlines. At 5 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was David Cho, one of the directors I still trusted. Michael, I need to talk. We met in his office, blinds closed. He looked exhausted. They're pressuring me, he said. Charles's people. Calls from 2 funds, today. They want me to resign. Say it's the only way to protect my reputation. You're one of the few steady voices left, I said. If you step down now, it will look like blood in the water. I know. He rubbed his temples. But they're digging into my past. Deals from 10 years ago, things that were immaterial but messy. If they put that in print, I'll never get another board seat. I leaned forward. David, this isn't about you. It's about breaking me. Don't give them the win. He exhaled. I'll try, but I can't promise. That night, alone in my study, I reread Clara's trust. It was ironclad, but ironclad wasn't the same as instant. Delaware Chancery had set a hearing date, 10 days away. 10 days in which Charles could poison the market, pressure allies, and make my leadership look untenable. And he was succeeding. The next morning, an email went out to all staff, unsigned but clearly planted. Concerns about founders' governance practices, HR monitoring situation. Panic spiked. Engineers who had been loyal to me for years started asking Amara if Orion was safe to stay at. At 11 a.m., I convened a town hall. Hundreds logged in on Zoom, their faces small boxes of doubt. I spoke plainly. Yes, there's noise. Yes, there's a campaign against me. But Orion's fundamentals remain strong. Customers depend on us, and our job is to deliver. Don't let rumors distract you. I saw some nods, but also blank stares. People were scared. I couldn't blame them. As soon as the call ended, my assistant handed me a note. Media request. Wall Street Journal wants comment on alleged Tahoe expenses. I shook my head. No comment until after Chancery. But silence felt like surrender. And every day of silence, Charles's narrative grew louder. That evening, Amara came to my office. She closed the door, her expression tight. Michael, I need to tell you something before you hear it elsewhere. They approached me. I frowned. Who? Charles's people. They said if I distance myself from you, there could be a COO role for me in the new structure. They implied my future is safer if I step away now. The words hit harder than I expected. Amara had been with Orion for 15 years. She was the one who stayed in the office with me past midnight, when we almost lost our first federal contract. If they were going after her, they were cutting to the bone. What did you say? I asked. I told them no. But I don't know how long I can hold out if they keep pushing. They're hinting at reputational damage. My husband's law firm just got a warning call. I stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the San Jose skyline. The city lights blurred. For the first time, I felt the clock not just ticking, it was accelerating. Charles had money, connections, and no shame about using them. Ethan had youth, polish, and the sympathy of employees who thought he represented the future. And me? I had Clara's envelope and 10 days of air cover from Chancery. Every hour mattered. At midnight, I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread out. The proxy blitz was buying votes. The leak was buying headlines. And my allies were being picked off, one by one. Clara's words echoed. Protect Orion. Protect him from himself. But how? I closed my eyes, exhaled, and made a decision. Tomorrow, I would stop playing defense. If Charles wanted a war of perception, I would bring one too. The hearing was in 10 days. If I survived until then, I could reclaim Orion, in fact, not just on paper. Until then, every move mattered, and the next one would have to hurt. The morning of the hearing, Wilmington's Chancery Court was packed tighter than I expected. Delaware corporate cases rarely drew crowds, but this one had all the elements of drama the market loves: founder versus son, Wall Street intrigue, super voting shares. I sat at the petitioner's table, my attorney beside me. Across the aisle, Ethan and Charles whispered with their own counsel. 3 lawyers from a white shoe firm billing more per hour than most engineers at Orion made in a week. Ethan looked polished in his tailored suit, but I noticed his foot tapping nervously under the table. Vice Chancellor Halpern entered, brisk and unsentimental. "We are here on Reed v. Orion Dynamics, docket 23-486. Motion for emergency declaratory relief. Counsel, you may begin." Our lawyer rose. "Your Honor, this case is simple. The respondent board attempted to remove Mr. Reed as executive chair for cause, but the action lacked factual basis. Pursuant to a notarized voting trust executed by Clara Reed, 60% of Class B supervoting shares revert to Mr. Reed under precisely these circumstances. We ask the court to confirm the trust's validity and enjoin any contrary board actions." Charles's counsel countered immediately. "Your Honor, this so-called trust is a relic, executed under duress while Mrs. Reed was on hospice care. To enforce it now would be to undermine shareholder rights and entrench a founder against his own board's fiduciary judgment." Halpern adjusted his glasses. "Counsel, hospice is not synonymous with incapacity. Do you have evidence of undue influence?" They shuffled papers, buying time. "We have concerns, Your Honor, but no direct evidence." The judge leaned back. "Concerns are not evidence. The document is notarized, witnessed, and properly filed. On its face, it is valid." He paused. "I am granting the motion for emergency declaratory relief. Until trial, Mr. Reed holds 60% of Class B voting power. Any attempt to dilute or circumvent this will be enjoined." The gavel came down. Just like that, the balance shifted. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Mr. Reed, what does this mean for Orion's future? Will you remove your son?" Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward. I kept my answer short. "The court has confirmed what my wife foresaw. Orion's future will be decided by facts, not manipulation. That's all for now." I left it at that. No gloating, no theatrics. The ruling spoke for itself. Back in San Jose that evening, I returned to my office for the first time in days. My assistant handed me a sealed envelope. This was dropped off by Mr. Baker. He didn't want anyone to see him bring it. I closed the door and tore it open. Inside were scanned documents. One stamped confidential side letter, Orion IP transfer. As I read, my chest tightened. It was a secret agreement, signed by Ethan 6 months ago, granting an option for a Cayman-registered shell to acquire Orion's most valuable intellectual property, our integration engine, for pennies on the dollar. The shell was tied to a private equity consortium, Charles advised. In other words, they weren't just trying to push me out. They were preparing to strip Orion of its core technology and bury it offshore. The cover note from Baker was brief. "Michael, I can't be part of this. If you use this, protect my identity." I sat back, staring at the pages. Clara's trust had given me control. This letter gave me proof. The following morning, I convened an emergency session of the board. Ethan looked smug, assuming the Chancery ruling would only slow him down. Charles radiated calm menace, as if nothing had changed. I began without ceremony. Yesterday, the court confirmed my control of Class B supervoting shares. But that's not the only issue. Mr. Baker has provided me with this. I slid copies of the side letter across the table. Directors bent over the pages. Frowns deepened. Karen Lopez looked up, incredulous. "Ethan, did you sign this?" Ethan's face paled. It was exploratory. Nothing binding." Charles leaned in. "This is confidential negotiation. Out of context, it looks worse than it is." I shook my head. "No, this is a betrayal. While telling employees and investors that Orion's future was cloud integration, you were preparing to siphon our core IP into a shell company controlled by Charles's associates. That's fraud." Voices rose around the table. "This exposes us legally. If the SEC sees this, our customers will revolt." Karen slammed her hand down. "This isn't governance anymore. This is theft." I let the room spiral for a moment before speaking again. "The court gave me authority to act. I am using it now. Effective immediately, Ethan is suspended as CEO pending a full investigation. Charles is barred from all Orion premises. Liza, prepare a disclosure for the SEC, transparent, complete, before someone else leaks it." Ethan's voice broke. "You can't do this. I'm your son." The room fell silent. All eyes on me. I answered quietly. "I can, and I must. Because this company doesn't belong to me, or to you, or to Charles. It belongs to the thousands of film employees who trust us with their livelihoods and the customers who depend on our software every day." No one spoke. Even Charles had no clever retort. The board adjourned in stunned silence. That night, alone in my office, I looked at Clara's photo on my desk. "You saw this coming, didn't you?" I whispered. Her note echoed in my mind. Protect Orion. Protect him from himself. The trust had given me power. The side letter had given me cause. For the first time since my birthday dinner, I felt not just defensive but decisive. The final piece had fallen into place. And now, it was my turn to move. The boardroom had never felt so heavy. 2 weeks of leaks, rumors, and proxy fights had taken their toll. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Half-empty water bottles cluttered the table. And no one made small talk as we took our seats. Even the leather chairs seemed uncomfortable, as if they knew we had reached the end game. I stood at the head of the table, not Ethan, not Charles, me. The court had confirmed the trust. The side letter had stripped away their credibility. Now all that remained was a vote to settle the question once and for all. I glanced at each director. Some avoided my eyes. Others looked at me with quiet relief. Everyone knew the company could not survive another week of uncertainty. "Before we begin," I said, my voice steady, "I want to make something clear. This isn't about me keeping a title. This isn't about family drama. It's about Orion's survival and the values this company stands for." I nodded to Liza, our general counsel. She opened her laptop and displayed the agenda on the screen. Emergency board action, CEO and executive chair succession. The room shifted uncomfortably. They hadn't expected me to move this fast. That was the point. "Your Honor," Charles's counsel had warned in Delaware, "Mr. Reed will use this trust to entrench himself indefinitely." They were wrong. My next move would prove it. I tapped the table. "I am calling a formal vote of this board. Effective immediately, I am relinquishing the role of executive chair. In my capacity as holder of 60% of Class B voting shares, I propose the following slate. I will serve as non-executive chair of the board, and Amara Patel will be appointed CEO of Orion Dynamics. Gasps filled the room. Even Amara herself looked stunned. Karen Lopez leaned forward. Michael, are you serious? After everything you fought for? Yes, I said firmly, because this fight was never about me staying in power. It was about protecting Orion from being stolen. That mission is complete. Now we need principled leadership to rebuild trust with employees, customers, and the market. And that leader is Amara. All eyes turned to her. She swallowed, composed herself, and spoke. I didn't expect this. But if the board believes I can lead, I'll serve. My promise is simple: transparency, stability, and focus on our customers. Charles scowled, but he was finished. Without Ethan's credibility and with the side letter exposed, he had no leverage. He muttered something about fiduciary irresponsibility, but the directors ignored him. I raised my hand. All in favor? Hands went up around the table, one after another. Karen, David, even Liza, who had tried to stay neutral until now. When the tally was complete, the vote was unanimous. Amara Patel was CEO. Ethan sat frozen, pale and silent. For weeks he had played the role of heir apparent, groomed by Charles, backed by bankers, admired by employees who thought youth was a strategy. Now he was just a son who had overreached. I turned to him. Ethan, you'll have time to consider your future. But effective immediately, your access to company systems is revoked. HR will coordinate your exit. This isn't punishment. It's accountability. He looked at me for a long moment. There was no anger left, only a hollow sort of recognition. He gathered his papers, stood, and walked out without a word. The door closed softly behind him. The silence that followed was profound. Karen broke it first. Michael, you just ended a proxy war without firing a shot. You could have kept everything, but you handed the reins to someone else. Why? I looked around the table, at men and women who had given years to Orion. Because legacy isn't about how long you hold a title. It's about whether the thing you built survives after you're gone. I'm not interested in monuments. I'm interested in endurance. Amara nodded. Then let's get back to work. The board session ended with handshakes and, for the first time in months, a sense of relief. As people filed out, I lingered in the empty room. I thought about Clara, the woman who had seen further than all of us, who had written the trust in a hospice bed to protect both the company and our son from himself. I whispered, "It's done." The days that followed felt lighter. The press spun the story as a rare victory for governance. Founder protects company, hands reins to new CEO. Employees rallied behind Amara's steady presence. Aerosys recommitted to its contract after she personally visited their headquarters. The stock bounced back, modestly but confidently. For me, the role shifted. As non-executive chair, I no longer signed off on daily operations. Instead, I mentored, advised, and, more importantly, listened. The company didn't need me in the trenches anymore. It needed me as a compass. And Ethan? He disappeared from the headlines. I heard he moved to Austin, started dabbling in crypto ventures, and kept his distance. Maybe in time he'd find his way back, not to Orion, but to himself. 1 month later, I stood in front of our annual all-hands meeting. Thousands of employees watched from San Jose, New York, and Bangalore. The auditorium buzzed with energy. I spoke plainly. When I founded Orion, I thought the hardest part would be writing code. But I was wrong. The hardest part is writing character into a company and protecting it when ambition threatens to erase it. In a world obsessed with algorithms, character is still the only code that compiles. Remember that, and Orion will outlast all of us. The applause was thunderous. I stepped off stage, handed the microphone to Amara, and knew in that moment that Orion was safe. If you've ever seen ambition fracture a family, or watched power tests the limits of loyalty, let this story remind you. Titles fade, but character remains. If this story resonates, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life tales of betrayal, power, and redemption. Because sometimes, the fight isn't about winning. It's about leaving behind something worth trusting.